Smoke curled above the Pacific long before anyone on American soil knew what was coming. But this isn't the story you already know of explosions, burning ships, and a date that lives in infamy. This is the story Japan saw. The story from inside the cockpits cutting through icy winds, inside the war rooms where fear hid behind false confidence, and inside the minds of pilots who wrote farewell letters they weren't sure anyone would ever read. Imagine standing on the deck of the Akagi, the cold biting through your gloves as you stare into a horizon that feels like the edge of the world, knowing that within hours, history will split in two. What did Japan truly believe? What did they misunderstand? And at what moment did their victory turn into the quiet realization that they had awakened something far larger than any empire could crush? This isn't just Pearl Harbor. This is what Japan saw at Pearl Harbor, and why it changed everything. Before we dive deeper into this untold perspective, hit that like button if you love real history told with honesty and humanity. Subscribe for more powerful documentary-style stories, and share this video if you think more people should understand both sides of history, not just the one written in textbooks. Alright, let's begin. The year 1941 rolled over Japan like a heavy mist, quiet, cold, and suffocating. On the surface, life in the empire carried on with the same disciplined rhythm, uniformed schoolchildren marching in unison, soldiers drilling on dusty parade grounds, factories humming with the determined clatter of machinery. But beneath that disciplined veneer, anxiety coiled like a tightening spring. Japan had been expanding its reach for years, carving out its Greater East Asia Vision one brutal campaign at a time, and the world was no longer willing to look away. Oil, the lifeblood of any modern military power, had become the empire's most fragile artery. When the United States froze Japanese assets and cut off 80% of Japan's crude supply, the shock was instant and devastating. Japan's leaders understood the math all too well. Their fuel reserves were enough for a year of peace, or barely 6 months of war. That realization settled into every briefing room, every naval conference, every late-night strategy session, and a silent, unavoidable truth. Japan wasn't preparing for war because it wanted to win. Japan was preparing for war because its back was against a wall, and the darkness behind it was far more terrifying than the danger ahead. Inside government chambers, arguments sprawled across polished wooden tables like invisible battles of their own. Civilian diplomats pushed for negotiation, desperate to buy time, convinced that America could be reasoned with if approached carefully. Militarists, the faction that had slowly seized control of Japan's destiny, felt cornered. They believed that American demands threatened not only Japan's geopolitical reach, but its cultural identity, its pride, its very sense of existence. To them, backing down was death by humiliation. Moving forward was death by fire. And yet, they chose fire. What makes this moment so haunting is how many of Japan's own leaders knew just how dangerous that choice was. Some had lived in America, studied its manufacturing power, walked its city blocks. Others had seen the sheer scale of US industry during international naval visits years before. But even these men with first-hand knowledge found themselves drowned out by the nationalistic tide. In public speeches, Japan spoke of destiny and honor. In private, officials whispered conversations laced with dread. How long will our fuel last? What happens if America doesn't blink? What if the war we think we can win is already lost before it begins? These whispers weren't recorded in official documents, but they hung in the air of every late-night emergency session, buzzing between military advisors like a secret only the bravest dared to acknowledge. For ordinary Japanese citizens, the picture was even more complex. Propaganda painted America as decadent, soft, and morally weak, an easy opponent if war ever came. Newspapers trumpeted the narrative that Japan was a tiger surrounded by paper dragons. Yet in backstreet bars, in the crowded living rooms of wooden homes, and in the quiet corners of military barracks, many felt confusion more than confidence. They didn't fully understand the politics. They didn't know about the oil crisis in exact numbers. They only sensed that something was shifting, something heavy. Merchants noticed gasoline growing scarce. Fishermen whispered about fuel restrictions. Mothers saw prices rising and asked one another why the world suddenly felt uncertain. And young men freshly drafted, barely trained, listened to officers describing America as a collapsing nation, while privately wondering if that was true. That tension created an atmosphere unlike anything Japan had experienced before, a nation wrapped in pride, but breathing in fear. Every citizen could feel the wind changing direction, but no one knew where the storm would land. They only knew it was coming. Within the Imperial Navy, that storm had a name: warfare by necessity. Admirals, pilots, engineers, men who had spent their entire lives studying strategy could see the grand map unfolding like a tragic equation. If Japan continued its expansion in Southeast Asia, America would react. If Japan backed down, its dreams of empire would collapse. Only one option remained: strike first, and strike so hard that America would hesitate long enough for Japan to seize the oil fields it so desperately needed. It was a strategy built on hope rather than certainty, a carefully crafted illusion that speed could overcome scale, that bravery could substitute for industry, and that a single decisive blow could convince a nation of 130 million people to accept defeat. As 1941 crept forward, this belief, half strategy, half prayer, began to thread itself through the Navy's ranks. Officers studied maps of Hawaii late into the night, tracing the narrow harbor entrances with trembling fingers. Pilots sharpened their skills with a focus that bordered on desperation. And in the minds of those closest to the planning, one chilling truth echoed louder each day: Japan wasn't preparing to win a long war. It was preparing to buy time, and time was already running out. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto carried a contradiction inside him that few in Japan's leadership could understand. On one hand, he was a loyal servant of the Imperial Navy, sharp, disciplined, fearless, and brilliant. On the other, he was a reluctant prophet, a man who had seen the United States not through propaganda posters or military reports, but through the lens of lived experience. During his years in America, he had wandered through Detroit factories roaring with industrial muscle, watched assembly lines spit out automobiles with mechanical precision, and sensed the restless confidence of a nation that believed any challenge could be turned into an opportunity. To the Japanese war faction, America was soft, decadent, lazy, too comfortable to fight. But Yamamoto had watched American workers move with a purpose that frightened him. He had seen their vast natural resources and their unparalleled manufacturing scale. And somewhere in his gut, he felt a warning: Japan was underestimating a giant that did not yet know its own strength. When political leaders dismissed his concerns, he was left with the burden of a truth no one wanted to hear. Yet despite that quiet dread, Yamamoto could not simply refuse the rising tide of militarism pulling Japan toward war. To oppose it openly was dangerous, even lethal. In an era where dissent was treated as disloyalty, and loyalty was measured through action rather than honesty, Yamamoto had to tread with careful precision. When he argued against provoking America, army hardliners labeled him a coward, some even threatened his life. In private, he wrote to close colleagues that if war broke out, he would run wild for 6 months. But after that, Japan would face a storm it was not prepared to endure. These were not the words of a hesitant man. They were the words of someone who understood mathematics, logistics, and industrial reality better than most. But the government's ambitions had outgrown hesitation. They believed destiny was on their side. And so Yamamoto realized that if he could not prevent the war, the only path left was to shape how it began. He needed to design a blow so sudden and overwhelming that America might hesitate long enough for Japan to seize the oil-rich territories of Southeast Asia. It was strategy born not from confidence, but from a terrifying sense of necessity. The idea of striking Pearl Harbor was shocking even within the Japanese Navy. Many officers saw it as suicidal and unnecessary gamble that could ignite exactly the kind of prolonged war Yamamoto feared. But he knew that fighting America head-on in a conventional showdown would be even worse. Japan could not win a war of attrition. It couldn't outbuild, outproduce, or outlast a nation whose factories, if provoked, could create more planes in a month than Japan could in a year. The only solution, Yamamoto believed, was to cripple the US Pacific Fleet so severely in the first hours of conflict that America would be forced into negotiations. The attack had to strike with a precision that bordered on perfect, not just ship for ship, not just base for base. It had to shatter American morale, break its will to fight before its engines could even warm up. For weeks, Yamamoto and his planners studied maps of Hawaii, examined tide patterns, calculated flight routes, and envisioned a strike that felt more like a magician's disappearing act than a naval battle. Everything depended on surprise. Everything depended on timing. Everything depended on the US believing, even for a brief moment, that Japan had achieved the impossible. It was a plan that demanded boldness, secrecy, and a little bit of madness, and Yamamoto knew it. But beneath the boldness of his plan, something more human lingered, an unease that clung to Yamamoto at moments. He often spoke of his fear that Japan was being pushed toward disaster by leaders who misunderstood the scale of the world beyond their shores. He feared that pride was drowning out reason. And perhaps most painfully, he understood that winning the first battle did not mean winning the war. In war councils, he delivered the attack plan with stoic precision, the model of a loyal admiral. But in private letters, he confessed doubts, as if writing down his fears might somehow ease their weight. He predicted months of early victories followed by years of crushing losses. He predicted industrial collapse, shortages, and a spiraling military decline. He even foresaw his own death, writing that he did not expect to survive a long war. Yet he continued forward, not because he believed in the attack's long-term success, but because he saw no alternative. Japan had cornered itself, and when a nation corners itself, the men in charge are forced to choose between bad options and worse ones. Yamamoto chose the option that bought time, even if it cost everything else. History would prove he was right, and tragically, right on a scale even he could not fully imagine. The months leading up to Pearl Harbor were unlike any period in the history of the Imperial Japanese Navy. In remote bays shrouded in mist, especially Kagoshima Bay, chosen because its shape eerily mirrored Pearl Harbor, pilots trained with a mixture of precision and desperation. Day after day, the landscape echoed with the roar of engines skimming meters above the water, the thump of torpedoes being released, and the bark of instructors shouting corrections through cold morning air. These pilots weren't just preparing for another mission, they were rehearsing a moment that would define the fate of their nation. Every maneuver, every dive, every torpedo run had to be flawless. Japan didn't have the luxury of replacement aircraft or endless fuel. They had one chance to strike a blow so clean, so devastating, that it would stun the world. And so the pilots flew until their muscles ached, until their palms bled from gripping controls, until the repetitive drills carved muscle memory so deep it felt like instinct. It wasn't confidence that fueled them, it was the sobering realization that they were training to attack a fortress that didn't even know they were coming. Among the pilots, quiet tensions simmered beneath the surface. Many were veterans of China, hardened but haunted. Others were barely older than boys, stepping into aircraft with the mixture of pride and fear that comes from being told you are doing something historic, but not knowing historic also means fatal. Traditional Japanese stoicism kept emotions sealed behind calm faces, yet late at night, in cramped barracks or on the decks of carriers under moonlit skies, small cracks appeared. Some men whispered about loved ones they had left behind. Others wrote letters that would only be opened if they never returned. A few wrestled with doubts that felt too dangerous to say aloud. Why was their government so certain that America was a weakened opponent? Why did their leaders believe a single strike could bring the US to the negotiation table? These questions drifted like shadows across their minds, but duty in Japan was not a matter of debate, it was a matter of identity. And so they silenced their doubts, straightened their uniforms, and stepped into the roles their nation had carved for them. War didn't ask whether they were ready. It only demanded obedience. Meanwhile, engineers and strategists labored in near secrecy to refine Japan's most daring innovations. They developed modified torpedoes fitted with wooden fins, so they wouldn't plunge too deep the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor. They tested armor-piercing bombs forged from repurposed battleship shells designed specifically to tear through American decks. It was ingenuity born not from abundant resources, but from necessity. Japan didn't have thousands of spare planes or factories that could flood the sky with replacements. Their elite pilots were irreplaceable. Each one was a carefully honed weapon carved from years of training. Losing even a handful would be a blow Japan could not easily absorb. Yet ironically, it was this scarcity that made them exceptionally skilled. They practiced carrier landings until they could touch down on a pitching deck in rough seas with their eyes half closed. They repeated torpedo runs until moving at treetop heights felt as natural as walking. Watching them train was like watching craftsmen, not soldiers artists shaping their final masterpiece, knowing they might never live to see the applause. By late autumn of 1941, the pilots knew Pearl Harbor like a place they had visited 100 times. They could trace the positions of the American battleships blindfolded. They knew the angles of attack, the timing of the waves, the corridors of approach that would thread them through American defenses. But beneath this mastery lingered an unsettling truth. However perfect their training, however precise their rehearsals, they were preparing for a real battle against a fleet and a nation they had never actually met in person. In their minds, Pearl Harbor still belonged to the realm of maps, diagrams, and guesswork. They had no idea how the Americans would react, how quickly the sky would fill with bullets, or whether the harbor they had practiced striking was anything like the one awaiting them. It felt like training to fight a ghost one that might turn out to be far larger, far stronger, and far more awake than anyone had predicted. And as the final days of preparation ticked away, one thought began to creep into their minds, quiet but undeniable. We are ready for the attack, but are we ready for what comes after? When the first air fleet slipped out of Haitokopu Bay under cold November skies, the world had no idea that history was moving quietly across the northern Pacific. The departure was ghost-like, no triumphant horns, no stirring speeches, just 6 massive aircraft carriers, dozens of escorts, and over 400 aircraft gliding into open ocean under strict radio silence. Even the sea seemed to hold its breath. On deck, sailors moved with hushed urgency, performing routine tasks that suddenly felt monumental. Pilots stood by the rails, staring into the horizon as if searching for a glimpse of their destiny. The vastness of the Pacific stretched before them, not a pathway, but a reminder of how far they were traveling into a world from which many of them might never return. The silence wasn't just a military order, it was a psychological weight. Every man aboard those ships knew that their success depended on remaining invisible, and invisibility meant isolation, no signals, no rescue, no turning back. As the fleet sailed deeper into the northern Pacific, the journey became a test of endurance as much as discipline. Storms crashed against the carriers with brute force, slamming waves onto decks and tossing aircraft like toys. Men clung to railings, soaked and freezing, while officers studied weather reports with growing alarm. A single careless moment could flip a plane into the sea or send a man tumbling into the icy dark, never to be found. Yet even these storms served a purpose. Their violence masked the fleet's passage, hiding it from American reconnaissance that would never think to search so far north. Still, the isolation gnawed at the pilots. Without radio chatter or outside contact, all they could hear were engines, the howl of wind, and their own thoughts repeating in endless loops. Would the attack go as planned? Would the Americans be asleep? Would they ever see home again? The monotony of the sea made these questions louder, sharper, impossible to ignore. In the quiet hours before dawn, men wrote last letters, by dim lantern light letters they hoped would never have to be delivered. But the silence was not just physical, it was emotional. Officers maintained a facade of calm, but beneath it, tension simmered. Vice Admiral Akagi Negamo, commanding the fleet, paced his flagship with the weight of the mission pressing heavily on his shoulders. He was tasked with executing a plan he had not fully supported, a plan he privately feared was too risky, too ambitious, too dependent on flawless surprise. Meanwhile, pilots like Mitsuo Fuchida, the man who would soon transmit Torah, tried to steel themselves for the moment when decisions would become irreversible. In the mess halls, conversations felt strangely hollow, as though everyone was speaking around the truth rather than acknowledging it. Even laughter, when it happened, carried an undercurrent of unease, like a flicker of humanity trying to survive in a moment too enormous for anyone to fully grasp. The fleet was moving toward glory or ruin, no one knew which, but every passing mile made both possibilities feel equally real. By the time the fleet neared its launch point on the morning of December 7th, the men had been living inside this bubble of silence for nearly 2 weeks. The world behind them felt distant, almost dreamlike. The world ahead felt overwhelming. Dawn crept across the water in muted shades of blue, revealing the carriers rising and falling on gentle swells. Pilots assembled on deck, tightening gloves, adjusting goggles, and exchanging nods that said what words could not. This was the threshold. Everything they had trained for, every torpedo run, every bombing drill, every lecture about American ship positions, was about to be tested in live fire. The air was thick with the smell of aviation fuel and the tension of unspoken fear. And in that fragile moment, as engines began to roar to life and the first aircraft taxied into position, a chilling realization settled across the fleet. The journey of silence was ending. But the noise that awaited them, the chaos of battle, the screams of war, the eruption of history was about to begin. The first wave lifted off the carriers just as dawn brushed the horizon, painting the sky in muted streaks of orange and blue. Engines growled, propellers carved the icy air, and the pilots, each carrying a piece of their nation's fate, pointed their aircraft toward Oahu. From above, the Pacific stretched like a quiet, endless canvas, giving no hint of the firestorm that was about to erupt. Mitsuo Fuchida led the formation, scanning the horizon with a mixture of tension and grim determination. Below his aircraft, the world looked deceptively peaceful. As the Hawaiian coastline began to materialize through the morning haze, the pilots steeled themselves. Their months of training were about to collide with reality. Battleships that had existed only as shapes on maps and models now lay visible in the harbor, hulking silhouettes, unaware of what was rushing toward them. At that moment, every heartbeat seemed to sync with the steady drone of engines. The entire mission, the entire gamble Japan had built its future upon, balanced on the wings of these approaching planes. When Pearl Harbor finally came into full view, the pilots felt a jolt of disbelief. Everything was exactly as intelligence had predicted. Battleships sat neatly lined along battleship row. Destroyers and cruisers were moored in perfect geometric patterns. Even aircraft on the airfields were parked wingtip to wingtip, as if inviting attack. But something else struck the Japanese airmen, the eerie stillness. No alarms, no scrambling crews, no flak bursts darkening the sky. The Americans were unaware, asleep in every sense that mattered. Fuchida hesitated for only a breath. Then he fired a single flare, signaling the final confirmation. Moments later, he transmitted the 3 words that would forever echo across history: Torah, Torah, Torah. It was not a battle cry. It was a code meaning complete surprise had been achieved. For the pilots hearing it, the message punched through the air like a lightning strike. This was it, months of fear, doubt, and preparation condensed into a single command. And with that, they descended toward the harbor, engines screaming, torpedoes armed, the calm morning sky about to explode into chaos. The first torpedoes sliced through the water like metal sharks, leaving thin white trails behind them. A heartbeat later, the harbor erupted. Thunderous blasts cracked open battleships' hulls. Towers of water shot skyward. Smoke churned upward in dark plumes that swallowed the once blue sky. Pilots swooped low, dodging masts and rising flames, releasing bombs that plunged through decks with terrifying accuracy. Some felt a flicker of triumph, professional pride in the precision of their strike. Others felt shock. The sheer destruction unfolding beneath them was greater than anything they had envisioned in training. Men on deck scrambled in confusion, some firing rifles at the incoming aircraft, others diving into the water as steel twisted and fire spread. For many Japanese pilots, the sight was overwhelming. They had trained to hit ships, to damage targets, to complete objectives. But witnessing the human chaos, the men running, shouting, burning introduced a new, unsettling reality. This wasn't just strategy anymore. This was war in its rawest form. As the first wave pulled away from the inferno and the second wave swept in, the full sensory weight of the attack settled onto the Japanese pilots. The smell of burning oil clung to the air even at altitude. Black smoke blanketed the harbor like a shroud. Flames leapt from the Arizona as its magazine detonated in a cataclysmic blast that shook the sky itself. Yet amid the destruction, something unexpected gnawed at the more seasoned airmen. The fuel depots along the shore remained untouched. The submarine base and dry docks were still intact. And most ominously of all, the American aircraft carriers, the true backbone of naval power, were nowhere to be found. As explosions rumbled beneath them, several pilots exchanged uneasy glances. This victory was too clean, too fast, too incomplete. It felt less like the end of a battle and more like the beginning of something larger, darker, and far harder to control. And as they banked away from the burning harbor to return to their carriers, a quiet, unspoken question followed them into the sky. What exactly had they awakened? When the Japanese strike force turned back toward its carriers, the men aboard were met with cheers, applause, and the electric hum of triumph. Sailors crowded the decks, waving and shouting as the returning aircraft appeared on the horizon. They believed wholeheartedly that they had just changed the fate of the war. Word spread quickly. Battleships had been sunk, airfields shattered, the Americans caught completely off guard. Pilots were embraced as heroes the moment they stepped off their planes, their faces still smudged with soot and adrenaline. For a brief, intoxicating moment, the First Air Fleet felt invincible. The gamble had paid off. The impossible had been delivered with near-flawless execution. In the officers' mess, sake cups were raised and toasts echoed across metal walls. Men laughed, relieved and roaring with pride. But beneath the celebrations, a strange tension hung in the air, thin, quiet, and unnoticed by many. Because among the returning pilots were voices that didn't quite match the tone of victory. Some of the more experienced aviators spoke in hushed tones about what they had seen and, perhaps more importantly, what they hadn't. They had been shocked by the extent of the destruction, yes, but even more shocked by the glaring omissions that stood untouched amid the chaos. The massive fuel tanks along the shore, each one containing enough oil to fuel the Pacific Fleet for months, remained perfectly intact. Dry docks and repair yards, the beating heart of any naval rebirth, had been spared. Submarine pens stood untouched, their doors like silent mouths waiting to swallow the next phase of the war. For pilots who understood the strategic value of these targets, the oversight felt like a missed opportunity, so large, it was almost surreal. They whispered their concerns to their superiors, urging a third wave to finish what the first had begun. Destroy the infrastructure, they argued, cripple Pearl Harbor beyond repair, strike at the oil, the dry docks, the maintenance hubs, the true pulse of American naval power. But when these messages reached Admiral Nagamo, they collided with fear, caution, and the razor-thin line he walked between boldness and disaster. Nagamo's dilemma was as heavy as any faced during the war. His carriers were exposed far from home, low on fuel, and surrounded by an ocean that could turn hostile at any moment. They had achieved surprise once, but that element was now gone. A third strike meant flying into a harbor now swarming with alert anti-aircraft guns, risking veteran pilots Japan could not replace. And looming in Nagumo's mind was the most chilling unknown: the American aircraft carriers. Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga were unaccounted for. Somewhere in the Pacific, hidden from sight, were the very ships that could reverse Japan's fortune in a single afternoon. If they found his fleet while his planes were in the air, the result would be catastrophic. With that fear twisting in his gut, Nagumo made the decision that would change the war. He refused the third wave. He ordered the fleet to withdraw. Tactical caution, he believed, was wisdom. Strategic disaster, history would later argue, was the price. Because the Pearl Harbor that Japan struck so effectively was not the Pearl Harbor that America would rebuild. The one left behind still had the tools, the fuel, and the infrastructure to rise stronger, faster, and angrier than before. As the fleet sailed home, the conflicting emotions among the pilots deepened. They had accomplished the mission flawlessly, but they couldn't shake the images that haunted them: the untouched tanks, the clear repair facilities, the sense that they had stunned the Americans, but not truly crippled them. And then there were the numbers: so few Japanese losses, so little resistance from the ground. It felt unnatural, too easy, like a victory wrapped in warning signs. Our enemies were sleeping, some pilots thought. That doesn't mean they are weak. Others replayed the attack in their minds, seeing flashes of American sailors fighting through fire and smoke with a kind of desperation that didn't match Japan's propaganda. Something in their instincts tugged at them. A giant doesn't die from a single wound. When they finally reached Japan, crowds welcomed them as heroes, banners flew, and newspapers declared Pearl Harbor the greatest naval victory in modern history. But inside the hearts of many who had been there, a quieter truth lingered, one they would only admit years later. Pearl Harbor had been a tactical masterpiece, and the opening chapter of a war Japan could never win. Because in sparing the infrastructure that mattered most, and missing the carriers entirely, Japan hadn't extinguished America's power. It had awakened it. In the days after Pearl Harbor, Japan celebrated with fireworks, parades, and headlines proclaiming the empire's unstoppable rise. But on the other side of the Pacific, something far more powerful was stirring. In Washington, D.C., a stunned nation shook off its disbelief and turned its shock into resolve. Factories that had been idling during the Great Depression were back to life overnight. Recruitment lines stretched down sidewalks, filled with men who had never imagined themselves in uniform, but now stepped forward without hesitation. America had been wounded, but not broken. And as news of the attack spread across the country, a new force emerged: unity. Political divisions evaporated. Regional tensions faded. The entire nation, from farmers to factory workers, from students to steel workers, felt the same burning conviction. Japan had not intimidated America. It had galvanized it. What Admiral Yamamoto had feared most, the awakening of a massive industrial machine, was now happening in real time, faster and more fiercely than anyone in Tokyo had anticipated. Inside America's factories, the transformation was nothing short of breathtaking. Plants that once built cars now forged bombers. Assembly lines that had produced household appliances were repurposed to churn out rifles, artillery shells, engines, and steel plating. The Ford plant at Willow Run, which had manufactured automobiles only months earlier, now produced a fully assembled B-24 bomber every 63 minutes apace, so astonishing that even American workers shook their heads in disbelief. Shipyards along the Atlantic and Pacific coasts erupted with energy. Welders worked night shifts under blazing arc lamps, sending sparks cascading over their boots as Liberty ships rose from empty docks, like iron giants taking their first breaths. In the time it took Japan to build a single merchant vessel, the United States could build dozens. Men and women, especially women, stepping into industrial roles for the first time, answered the call with a determination that felt both personal and national. Every rivet, every bolt, every steel beam hammered into place was infused with the same unspoken vow: this will never happen again. For Japanese pilots and commanders, the first hints of this awakening were subtle, quiet ripples that grew into tsunami waves. Reports trickled in showing American production numbers that seemed impossible. Factories were turning out aircraft faster than Japan could train pilots to fly them. Shipyards launched new carriers, while Japan struggled to replace the ones it had lost. Even when Japanese forces won early battles across the Pacific, intelligence officers noticed something unnerving. American losses were quickly replenished, sometimes within weeks. Japanese losses, however, cut deep and stayed deep. Every veteran pilot lost over the Pacific was a wound Japan could not heal. Every sunken ship took years, not months, to replace. Slowly, Japan realized that it was not fighting the America it had imagined a supposed soft, distracted country unwilling to endure hardship. It was fighting an America fueled by a scale of industry and unity that dwarfed anything the empire could muster. And worse still, that America was only getting stronger. By 1943, the full impact of the giant's awakening became undeniable. American aircraft darkened the skies over the Pacific in numbers Japan had never seen before. New carriers, sleek, vast, bristling with aircraft, appeared faster than Japanese intelligence could report them. Submarines prowled shipping routes with deadly efficiency, choking off Japan's access to oil, rubber, and food. The empire that had once expanded across Southeast Asia now found itself shrinking under the weight of a war it could no longer sustain. Japanese pilots began to speak openly about their fear not just of death, but of irrelevance. They would take off for missions knowing the enemy had more planes, more fuel, more replacements, and more time. On the ground, Japanese commanders studied the numbers with growing horror. The truth was as clear as it was devastating. Pearl Harbor had not weakened America, it had awakened it. And the giant that now stood against Japan was not just powerful, it was relentless, unyielding, and determined to end the war on its own terms. In the months following Pearl Harbor, Japan moved across the Pacific like a rising tide, winning battles, capturing territory, and expanding its empire in bold, sweeping arcs. But beneath that wave of early victories lay a truth known only to the sharpest minds in the Imperial Navy. Their window was closing. American industry was catching up, and Japan needed one more decisive blow, something so crushing that it would force the United States to negotiate before the balance tipped completely. That final, desperate hope centered on a small speck of land, Midway Atoll. The plan was ambitious, elegant, and fatally optimistic. By drawing America's remaining carriers into a trap, Japan believed it could deliver a knockout strike, destroying the last pillars of the US Pacific Fleet. If it worked, Japan would regain control of the seas. If it failed, the consequences would be irreversible. And in Tokyo's war rooms, where maps were spread across long tables and officers argued over fate, no one realized that the Americans were already waiting, listening, decoding, preparing for the exact blow Japan believed would decide the war. The turning point began long before the first shot was fired. Unbeknownst to Japan, American codebreakers had cracked portions of the Imperial Navy's communication system. They knew an attack was coming. They knew it was aimed at Midway. And they knew Japan needed this victory far more than America did. When the Japanese fleet approached the atoll in early June 1942, expecting surprise, they sailed into a battlefield already shaped by American foresight. Yet on the morning of the attack, the Japanese pilots performed with the precision and discipline that had made them feared across the Pacific. Their first wave smashed parts of Midway's facilities, filling the air with smoke and fire. But Admiral Nagamo hesitated. He received reports of American aircraft carriers nearby, too close for comfort. Torn between rearming his planes for a second strike on the island or preparing for ship-to-ship combat, he chose a compromise, that would prove disastrous. Below deck, chaos erupted as bombs, torpedoes, fuel lines, and aircraft crowded together in a volatile dance. Above deck, spotters scanned the horizon for American ships that had already taken position. The battle reached its breaking point in a single, unforgettable moment. As Japanese crews scrambled to switch armaments, American dive bombers pierced through gaps in the sky like falling blades. Their timing was uncanny, almost supernatural. In less than 5 minutes, they turned the tide of the entire Pacific War. 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Koga, and Soryu, were engulfed in roaring infernos, their decks exploding in cascades of flame. Sailors leapt into boiling waters. Pilots tried desperately to get airborne, but found runways collapsing beneath them. The pride of Japan's carrier fleet, the very heart of its naval aviation, was being torn apart before their eyes. For the seasoned aviators who had survived Pearl Harbor, the scene was almost impossible to comprehend. These were the ships that had launched the attack heard around the world. These were the carriers that had changed history. And now they were burning, sinking, disappearing beneath black smoke and the relentless churn of the sea. The shock wasn't just military, it was spiritual. Japan hadn't just lost ships. It had lost thousands of years of accumulated naval prestige in a single, brutal hour. As the final carrier, Hiryu, fought alone and ultimately fell, a realization settled across the Japanese military shadow that would never fully lift. Midway was not just a battle. It was the moment the war pivoted toward defeat. Japan had lost its elite pilots, men who had trained 4 years and could never be replaced in time. It had lost carriers, it had no industrial power to rebuild quickly, and it had lost the strategic initiative that had carried it from victory to victory since the war began. Midway exposed the truth that Yamamoto had feared from the beginning. Japan's early success had been built on precision, surprise, and daring, not sustainability. America, on the other hand, was just beginning to unleash its full potential. As the survivors of Midway returned home, their faces hollowed by exhaustion and grief, they understood something that the jubilant crowds in Tokyo could not yet see. Pearl Harbor had awakened the giant. Midway had armed it. And from this point on, Japan would be fighting not for victory, but for time it no longer had. By late 1943, the once confident skies of the Pacific had transformed into a place of quiet dread for Japanese pilots. Gone were the days when they ruled the air with unmatched skill and elite training. The veterans who had dominated the early war were now gone, lost over Midway, the Coral Sea, Guadalcanal, and countless smaller islands whose names blurred into a tragic elegy. In their place stood young, inexperienced replacements rushed through shortened training programs that stripped away the artistry, discipline, and precision that had once defined the Imperial Japanese Navy. Many of these new pilots had logged barely 100 hours of flight time before being thrown into combat. Against them stood American aviators flying better aircraft, backed by an industrial machine that could replace every loss 10 times over. Every time a Japanese plane fell into the sea, it wasn't just a machine dying, it was a future that Japan no longer had the resources or time to rebuild. The sky that had once felt like an open canvas now felt like a closing trap. Fuel shortages tightened the noose even further. Japan's early gains across Southeast Asia had given it temporary access to oil fields, but American submarines were now sinking tankers and cargo ships at a terrifying rate. Every drop of aviation fuel became a precious commodity. Pilots who once trained daily now flew only sporadically, scraping together minutes in the air that barely kept them proficient. Some practiced maneuvers with their planes chained to the ground because gasoline was too valuable to waste. Others watched helplessly as their aircraft sat idle on runways, wings gathering dust, engines cold. Meanwhile, American pilots were flying constantly, training, drilling, fighting. Their aircraft flooded the Pacific in formations so large that they blotted out the sun during major operations. To Japanese pilots, encountering these swarms felt surreal. as if they were fighting a faceless, endless machine rather than individual men. They shot down a few, but more always came, more planes, more carriers, more waves of relentless steel and fire. And with every battle, the imbalance grew sharper, more painful, more impossible to ignore. By 1944, Japanese aviators began to describe something they had never experienced before: hopelessness. Battles that should have been victories turned into massacres. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, now infamous as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Japanese pilots flew into a sky they barely recognized, a sky dominated by radar-guided American squadrons, bristling carrier groups, and anti-aircraft fire so dense it felt alive. In a single day, hundreds of Japanese aircraft were shot down, many with their engines barely warmed. Some pilots never even reached the American fleet before being torn apart by interceptors. Others, seeing the hopelessness ahead, muttered quiet apologies to their families in the final seconds before their planes erupted in flame. When the surviving pilots returned to their carriers, they found empty decks where entire squadrons had once stood. Commanders walked among the wreckage with cold, hollow eyes, knowing that Japan had just lost the last remnants of its elite aviation corps. The empire that had once stunned the world with precision and daring now struggled to keep even a single air group intact. And then came the final, devastating shift, the moment when Japan's strategy turned from offensive might to desperate sacrifice. Without trained pilots, without fuel, without aircraft that could match American machines, Japan made a tragic decision to harness its remaining aviators not as warriors, but as weapons. The kamikaze units were born not out of zeal, as propaganda portrayed, but out of necessity. Young men, barely trained, were asked to give their lives in suicide missions to compensate for a power Japan no longer possessed. Some volunteered with trembling hands, others were pressured, and many simply accepted their fate in grim silence. Their departures were cloaked in ceremony, but behind the solemn rituals was a truth as heartbreaking as it was undeniable. The sky no longer belonged to Japan. It belonged to the giant they had awakened at Pearl Harbor, an enemy whose ships filled the horizon, whose planes shadowed the clouds, and whose factories ensured that no matter how many machines Japan destroyed, more would always rise to take their place. By the time the last of the kamikaze units took flight, the war was no longer a contest of empires. It was a countdown, and Japan was running out of everything: planes, pilots, fuel, hope, and time. By the beginning of 1945, the Japanese Empire stood like a shadow of its former ambition. Cities lay in ruins from relentless bombing raids. The Imperial Navy had been reduced to scattered remnants, and the once proud air fleets existed mostly on paper. Yet what weighed heaviest on the hearts of Japan's surviving pilots and military leaders was not simply defeat, it was recognition. A recognition that had begun quietly after Pearl Harbor, grown louder after Midway, and now echoed unmistakably through every devastated harbor and silent airfield. The war they had entered, believing they could win quickly, had transformed into a grinding, unavoidable reality. Factories couldn't keep up. Fuel tanks were empty. Even the most loyal officers could no longer deny what their own eyes revealed. Their nation had gambled everything on one decisive blow, and instead of breaking America's resolve, they had ignited it. For many who had once believed in the promise of quick victory, the true cost of that miscalculation was only now becoming painfully clear. Among those who felt this realization most deeply were the surviving veterans of the Pearl Harbor attack. Men like Lieutenant Zenji Abe, who had once dived through the smoke and flames with absolute confidence in Japan's destiny. Now, years later, he flew over landscapes charred by firebombs, over bases where empty fuel drums outnumbered aircraft, and overseas where American ships patrolled with impunity. His memories of the glorious morning at Pearl Harbor haunted him not because of the destruction he had caused, but because of the moment he understood its meaning. Even on that first day, amid the explosions and chaos, he had seen things that didn't fit the narrative of effortless victory: the massive fuel depots untouched, the docks intact, the American carriers absent. What he hadn't understood fully then, but understood painfully now, was that Japan had only shocked America, not crippled it. The nation he had helped provoke was one capable of summoning a force so vast, so industrially powerful, that resisting it became like standing beneath a waterfall with a cup. For Admiral Yamamoto, the man who had predicted this outcome from the start, the final realization came earlier and more personally. He had warned that Japan could run wild for 6 months, but after that he could guarantee nothing. His prophecy proved tragically accurate. By the time he was killed in 1943, shot down after American codebreakers intercepted his flight plan, Japan's momentum was already fading. Yet even in death, his warning hung over every defeat that followed. Officers quoted him in frustration, pilots invoked him when they saw their own ranks thinning, and citizens, hearing his words repeated in whispers, wondered why no one had listened. Yamamoto's ghost became a symbol not of failure, but of foresight. The man who had once walked American streets and seen its industrial power up close had understood from the beginning what countless others only realized when it was too late. Japan wasn't fighting another nation. It was fighting an engine that, once awakened, would not stop until the war was over. When the end finally came in August 1945 with Hiroshima and Nagasaki reduced to ash and silence, it felt less like a surprise and more like the closing of a story that had been writing itself since the first torpedo hit Battleship Row. For the surviving pilots, soldiers, and civilians, defeat carried a strange mixture of sorrow, relief, and quiet contemplation. Many wondered how different things might have been if the warnings had been heeded, if diplomacy had prevailed, if the attack on Pearl Harbor had been seen not as a bold stroke of destiny, but as the gamble it truly was. In the years that followed, men like Zenjiabe dedicated themselves to peace, speaking openly about the illusions they had once believed and the truths they had come to understand. They confessed their doubts, their fears, their regrets not out of shame, but out of a desire to prevent future generations from repeating the same mistakes. And in their testimonies, one lesson emerged time and time again. Japan had not lost the war because it lacked courage. It lost because it misunderstood power. The story of Pearl Harbor, then, is not simply a tale of attack and retaliation. It is a story of perception and misperception, a story of how a nation can convince itself of myths in the absence of truth, a story of how bravery, discipline, and skill cannot compensate for the realities of math, industry, and scale. The Japanese pilots who launched from their carriers on that cold December morning believed they were striking a decisive blow against a weakened enemy. Instead, they awakened something far larger, a nation whose capacity for unity and production dwarfed anything Japan could match. The final realization, etched into the memories of those who survived, was as profound as it was painful. Pearl Harbor was not the beginning of Japan's victory. It was the beginning of its end, and in understanding that truth, they carried forward a message more powerful than any weapon they ever flew: that war built on illusion will always collapse beneath the weight of reality.